So in this chapter, chapter 10, what I want to do is talk a little bit about survey research. And so this would be probably one of the most widely used techniques for gathering data. There's lots of forms that these surveys take, and so in this chapter we'll have a little bit of an overview of that process, but then also we'll have a little bit of a discussion of just how surveys have sort of grown out of this this positivist approach where we're focused on data. Okay, so the types of research questions that typically can be addressed with a survey device would be first behavior. This is typically trying to get at how often or how frequently you do something. Surveys are also used to determine your attitudes, beliefs, or opinions. You see this a lot in politics, when they take polls. Another way of thinking of a poll would be a survey, and this would be basically an assessment of how you think things are or how you think things ought to be. Surveys also try to capture characteristics. These would be characteristics like, are you a male or female? Are you married, single, or divorced? That kind of thing. Expectations, basically, do you plan to do something or not do something? Self-classifications, this would be something where there might be a technical definition, an academic definition of something, but this is someone asking you whether you consider yourself to be that case. So an often one that this is used for would be something like, are you Catholic? Are you religious? Are you a good driver? Right? I mean, things that you have to define yourself. And then finally, you could have surveys that try to capture how much knowledge you have about a certain topic, right? Do you understand that the demand curve is downward sloping? What does a demand curve look like? So one of the earliest forms of surveys was actually the census. A census, in the case of the United States, is required every 10 years, and it's basically capturing the characteristics of the households in the United States. How many people live in that household? What are the names of the people who live in those households? How are they related to each other? That's all a census, and basically the conducting of that census is basically conducting a survey. Also, surveys came to be widely used during the social survey movement. This happened especially in the 1960s, but a little bit into the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Then within surveys, you also have the modern quantitative survey research theme or motivation, and this comes down to surveys that were sort of designed after the physical sciences and this attempt to make social sciences more scientific. Also, you see this kind of just explosion of the amount of surveys that are done after World War II, simply because the government's getting more involved in assessment of government programs. And then finally, you also have the development within universities and colleges of survey research centers, trying to capture certain attitudes, trying to conduct political polls. And then you also have the commercial polling. That would especially be the political polls that we see. So, for some of you, in your research projects, you may have a survey device that's used to outline what's being done. And so the way that a survey is designed is that in step one, that's at the very top of this screen, you are essentially then developing your hypothesis. You're thinking about how you're going to conduct that survey, whether it be with interviews, mail, or by the telephone. You're then going to write out those questions, perhaps think of the categories for one to answer those questions with, and you're going to basically then have outlined a survey. Then In step 2, you're going to plan things out, test things out. In step 3, you're thinking about the population and the sample that's going to receive the survey. In step 4, you're then actually conducting the data. In step 5, you're entering the data and getting ready to perform an analysis and then perform the analysis. And then in step 6, you're collecting all of the data together. A pretty straightforward process for a survey. Now, typically, the writing of the survey can be a little bit complicated. You don't want to you don't want to basically lead the respondent into answering in a particular way. You want to avoid some jargon or slang that might not have a clear definition or that the respondent may not understand. Obviously, you don't want to have your questions be confusing or vague, but you also then want to avoid emotion. You want to have your questions not be leading so that you encourage the respondent to give you a particular answer. And then also you want to avoid the double-barreled question. This would be where you have more than one issue going on in the question, and so then the respondent might be confused or give you an ambiguous answer. Now, if you want examples of what bad survey questions look like, I would encourage you to look on page 318 in the textbook. Also, when you're thinking about these survey questions, again, and this is coming largely from page 318 in the textbook, you certainly want to avoid questions that go beyond the knowledge that the respondent has. You do want to you certainly want to avoid double negatives, where then a double negative becomes a positive, right? Saying something like, you don't want to refuse to do something. Not refusing to do something becomes then that you are doing it. You also want to avoid talking about future intentions that are off in the distance, primarily because that person might not actually do that thing because it is so far into the future. And then you also want to avoid using the false premise or having overlapping categories so that the person is uncertain of what category they think they belong to. Now, if you're talking about a sensitive topic, let's say that we're talking about someone's family life, whether they love their parents, or let's say that we're talking about something quite intimate, right? Like your love life with your marital partner. You're not just, if it's a stranger, you're not just going to be able to ask them, how often, do you sleep with your husband or wife, right? You're going to need to develop some comfort and trust. I can't use, in this case, right, I can't even use the question I just said because I'd want to have some enhanced phrasing. In other words, I can't say, how often do I sleep with my wife? Well, she sleeps in the same bed with me every night, right? So, but that's not getting at probably the question that I was trying to ask. And then also, I may want to use some anonymous questioning methods, and you'll see these outlined in the book. This would be the CASI, the CAPI, and the RRT. And then also, to get an honest answer to my survey, I need to be also concerned with my social desirability bias. And this would be the problem where people give me a socially acceptable answer when it might not be, in fact, the case, right? So if I was talking about, do I always practice safe sex? I would probably say yes to the survey person because I know I'm supposed to say that, but that may not, in fact, be the case. So you see these kinds of things then outlined here. In my knowledge question, I may try to think about having sleeper questions. These would be, non-existent things, and I'm trying to see if the respondent is responding truthfully, right? So I could say, have you ever met Mickey Mouse, right? And Mickey Mouse being a fictional character. If they say yes, and they actually haven't, right? I mean, yes, it is possible that a person could be named Mickey Mouse, but for the most part, right, they haven't met a oversized mouse. So in that case, if they say yes, the respondent might not be truthful to me. Or I may want to think about contingency questions, where the response to one question leads to a second question. The partially open question, this then also is within the partially open question, it's a question that has an open answer, but there are fixed choices, and the options basically are linked to each other within my questions. Okay, so when we think about open versus closed questions, this is then where you have to think about which you want to use. So let's just start first with the open-ended question. An open-ended question would be something like, tell me about your religious practices. So that would be something where someone can tell me everything from, I pray every day, I go to mass every day, right? They could say all these kinds of things, or they could just say, I don't do anything, right? I mean, there's a infinitely large number of possible responses that I could get, and that's exactly what this first bullet point highlights. Now, an advantage as well is that the respondent can then also give me a detailed response, as detailed as they want to be. They can clarify their responses, right? They could say, I'm a very religious person, right? And with this open-ended question, they can tell me why they think that is the case. Also, it's sometimes useful because as the person who's conducting the survey, I might get responses that I did not anticipate at all. And when I'm talking about something like, tell me your religious practices, since it is such a complicated thing, someone can then give me an adequate answer to that really complex issue. And then as the last two bullet points identify, I also have a way then that the person can identify what they think of someone being religious, right? So an example would be, I could say I'm religious, yet I don't go to mass, I don't go to, I don't read the Bible every day, yet I pray every day. And if I think that is what makes me religious, right, then you've got an idea of like how I'm thinking about things, what I think of, how I define religion itself. That's all things that I can only get with an open-ended question. Now, the advantage to the closed-ended question, though, is that it's a lot easier for the person to respond. They might have 3 or 4 choices, maybe even just 2 choices, and they select one of the things. It's obviously easier to code and statistically analyze these choices because I only have a certain number of choices that can be given. When I'm talking about something like how religious they are, I might not ask that question. I might say, how often do you go to Mass? And have a few options. And so then someone might be able to give me an answer to that sensitive topic because they just have to select one simple choice. It's also convenient because if the thing is a very complicated question, it simplifies it. I'm less likely to get some confusion. I can also probably speak to a larger segment of the population with complicated questions because I have essentially simplified it for them with the answers. And then finally, it's also just really easy to replicate this survey from individual to individual. Now, it turns out that the advantages of the closed really become the disadvantages of the open. And we're going to see that then also with the disadvantages of the closed. In the disadvantages of the open, we would find that then it's really hard for me to code these things. I might just be given too much detail by the respondents such that it's hard for me to sort through things. There might be some people that are extremely extrovert and give me very long responses. Some people might be too thoughtful, though, not give me very much of a response, might not think that their opinion counts, and so then I don't get as good of a response as I need. It's going to take a long time to do this kind of survey. And also, it might be a question that the respondent, when they're answering it, might not even remember the question by the time they get through everything. So it's you're going to have to balance these advantages and disadvantages very carefully depending on what your research topic is. And then the disadvantages of the closed are, in some sense, the advantages of the open. And so I almost let me spend just a few moments on this slide here. Essentially, I am boxing individuals in with closed-ended questions to only giving me certain responses, and that might not be appropriate. Also, with a closed-ended question, as I'm conducting this statistical analysis, I could have coding errors. Questions could be misinterpreted, and I'd actually have no idea that it was being misinterpreted. If there are too many choices, the person might get confused. And also, the responses might just be too simplified, and I just might not be getting a good response then as a result of that. When you're constructing this questionnaire and you're thinking about how to get a valid response, you have to be very careful about the swayed opinion. In the swayed opinion, basically what I'm doing here is it's kind of related to the social desirability bias. And it's basically a person that falsely overstates a position, right? So this would be, again, if we were talking about like safe sex practices. If I said that I always engaged in safe practices, always, right, I might be overstating the case, or I could say never doing something, right? And again, that could be overstating the case. But I might go to those extremes based on what is socially desirable. I also have to be careful about the false positive and the false negative. In the false positive here, I'm talking about a person who is selecting a position, identifying a position, but they don't have any knowledge to actually say that they have that thing, right? So I could say, are you Republican or Democrat? But if they really are not really engaged in politics and they have not even sorted out what they are they really Republican or Democrat? And then also with the false negative, here the person might just refuse to answer or withhold their answer for some reason. Maybe I haven't built up enough trust with the person or whatnot. And then we also just might have the neutral position that comes from satisficing. And this is when a person doesn't pick any opinion on the matter, and really it's just because they don't want to make the effort to actually come up with a response. Now, as I'm thinking further about these valid responses, I may want to think about floaters. These would be things where a person is answering the question anyway, even though they don't have the information. And this could come from either the quasi or the full filters aspects of their questions, or it could come from something related to the recency effect. In the recency effect, what they're doing is they're just choosing the last answer as a way to not even think about the other options. So they're being lazy again. They're not thinking about things. It's kind of related to not having enough information as comes from the floaters. Or they could just be engaged in selective refusal. They could just choose to not answer some questions, either because they think it's too sensitive or they just are too lazy to answer them. So, if you're thinking then about having closed-ended questions, and you're thinking about categories. This would be a pretty good list of category choices to have for closed-ended questions. So if you're starting to think about having a survey device in your research project, these would be something you'd want to think about using. And again, you'd also want to be concerned about, with wording issues, whether you are using specific words that are going to strongly influence how people answer questions. Let me give you an example of this. Let's say that I'm trying to talk about food stamps. And in talking about food stamps, I say, do you want people to go hungry and not have access to food stamps? Well, having people go hungry, I mean, not too many people want others to go hungry. So they're probably going to say, yes, people should have food stamps. I could reword that same question and say, food stamps end up costing taxpayers money. Do you think people should be given food stamps? Needy people should be given food stamps. Well, now, right, I'm getting at the fact that people don't like paying taxes and paying for things. And so now I might be encouraging people to say, no, food stamps shouldn't exist at all. So I need to, when I'm thinking about the design of my survey device, I certainly need to think about the length of my questionnaire. Are people actually going to want to sit through this entire survey device? And then I really need to think about how I'm going to organize the question. The order of the questions absolutely matters. And I need to funnel people from very broad topics to more specified things. So you need to think carefully about the order of the questions. Related to that, you want to link questions or relate similar questions together. You want to create a matrix, right? So you see this here. I'm asking a series of questions on the first two about divorce, right? And here, I'm ordering my categories here, right? Too easy, too difficult, about right. I have my extremes first, and then someone answering it's about what it should be. Or alternatively, I could have my format be something where I have a statement and a person has to pick strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or don't know. I've organized some, right, in this case I'm talking about teachers, how fast they talk, and the difficulty of the exams they give in their preparation. I've organized all of these questions together under one heading so that that person is in that mindset of thinking about things. Now, I also need to think about non-responses. Why are they not answering what they should? Now, a non-response rate for things like a mail survey is going to be quite high. 90% would not be, 90% of the people not turning back a survey would be approximately what you would expect. And so you need to think about why that is the case. But let's be careful that about what non-response means, because the response rate basically is dependent upon 5 other things: non-location, non-contact, ineligibility, someone refusing to participate, or someone not completely participating. And I'm going to presume that you can read here what's in the box 10.9 from the textbook, so I'm not going to elaborate on that any further. So again, I said that the response rate when you're doing mailings are quite high. And so you may want to think about, if it is that high, yet it would be the way that you reach the largest number of individuals, you may want to give some thought to how I can improve that response rate. Well, one way I could do it is I could address it to a specific individual. Maybe I would even handwrite it, right? So now the person who reads it is more likely to open the mail, right? And now that I've addressed a specific person, they might be more inclined, right? Instead of it saying, dear resident or addressee. I may also want to, in that letter, build trust, right? Guarantee some confidentiality, tell them why I'm doing what I'm doing, give them a way to contact me, be incredibly polite. Don't put them at any cost to actually fill out the survey. Have the survey be simple. But then also I might want to think about, right, how am I following back with people to make sure that they filled out the survey? Am I giving them some reminders? Am I avoiding incredibly busy times when people might not think about things? Do I want to think about who it is that's sponsoring my survey and using their reputation to get people to trust me more, right? Say I'm with the University of Hawaii. Or I may just want to pay people to complete it, right? That would be a simple way to get it. When we think about these 4 different ways that I conduct the surveys, let's just talk about these 4 different ways. And they basically have trade-offs. The mail questionnaires, again, they are cheap. Web surveys are perhaps the cheapest. Yet, with cheapness, with speed, length, and response rate, these are the trade-offs that you have. This is the choice that you are going to have to make as you develop your survey device, if that's what your research is going to require. And that's what you're going to need to think about and then justify to me why you are picking that method of your survey. So if you are choosing a survey, I would strongly encourage you to think about this table that came from the readings so that you can think about why it is that you think you're going to use a particular method or not. And then if you are doing your survey as a face-to-face interview, you may then need to think about whether you're going to have the interview be a conversation or whether you're actually going to have specified questions. So if you're using that kind of survey, a interview survey, you're then going to need to justify why you are using a survey interview or an ordinary conversation. So pay attention to this slide if that's the research protocol that you're going to use. And so then we could think about, in some surveys, that I may want to engage in some probing, right? And in the probing, what I'm doing is I'm starting out with a simple question. What is your occupation? And then you can see how I'm drilling down further and further and further, right? I'm saying, well, tell me specifically what you do at General Motors. How long have you worked there? And I'm just basically drilling in further about what it is that you first answered about, right? Based on the last thing that they had talked about. Now, as well, when I'm thinking about doing interviews, I need to think about my naive assumption model. And in my naive assumption model here, what I need to think about is the fact that the person who's conducting the survey, they may, we're kind of assuming here that they've thought about all the different variables that they have, that the questionnaire itself doesn't have any wording or order issues, that the respondent wants to answer, that they're motivated for the right reasons to give me responses, that the respondent exactly understands what I'm asking them and that they're giving me a truthful answer, that they basically trust me, that the interview as I'm conducting it isn't influencing that person, and that their behavior actually matches their responses. Now, do we actually think that that all happens? Probably not. And then we also need to think about the fact that I, as the interviewer, also have some bias, right? the interviewer might be thinking about things differently because others are around them. They might be sloppy, and they might, as they're being interviewed, they might give me a different response. They might be trying to match my expectations because I'm dressed in a particular way. They might be giving me a different answer. Maybe because I say I'm with a certain initiative that reflects a cause. Let's say I'm with the Democrat Party, then they might give me Democratic responses. These would all be things you need to think about as you're thinking about your survey device. So if you've got a research project that involves a survey device, I want you to pay particular attention to this chapter because it would be what I'm looking for in the research assignments.